In the same way that recording videos for grammar, I think has been useful because people can go back and re-watch and make notes separately. I think that's worked quite well. I want to do the same for language change. What that means is hopefully the kind of the content and the background theory and the key ideas you can look at in your own time and make notes on, so that we can spend the bulk of lesson time looking at texts and analysing them and looking at actually what is going on in the texts themselves. So this is the first one really, which is just a bit of an intro and background to language change. On the OCR spec, the earliest a text will come from is 1600. So with this really, I'm going a little bit before that. I'm giving you the sort of the background and history that leads to that point in 1600. But please just be aware that these things are, some of them are several hundred years before actually the first date that a text would come from. So I think it's useful and important to know as background, but you probably wouldn't bring them into your essay. Okay, so something that happened in the 1400s isn't massively relevant to a text from 1650. Okay, it's good background, it's good to know, it's good to explain why some of these things might be found in these texts, but just don't get too drawn in, if you're writing about a text, even if it is from 1600, of talking too much about the, at length about what was going on in the 1300s. So just be aware of that. So firstly, I mean, that's where English comes from, and we get English sort of hovering there, don't we? Sort of from Germanic, sort of from Latin, because actually it's a much more complex language than many of the others. Quite a lot of the other languages you'll see that actually they start as this proto-European level and then break off into certain areas, and then in a fairly linear way sort of split into the languages that they become. English is a really complicated one because basically Great Britain has been invaded several times and has had influence from all sorts of different places. So we've had a lot of Latin influence because through the Roman Empire, the Romans brought a lot of their language and that has stuck around. Similarly, though, we've got a lot of Germanic influence because from the Anglo-Saxons, a lot of Germanic came into the language, and also we've got a lot of French because from the Norman invasion in 1066, their language started to come in. So English is a real hybrid language. It has all features of all of them, and a key thing you could do is look at which words seem to come more from Germanic, which words seem to come more from French, which words seem to come from Latin, and there are some hacks to sort of find those words, but that's lexically a very interesting point to make, and over time it changes. English in the 1600s is a bit closer to French. Before that, it's closer to Germanic. If we look at a very formal text, there might be more Latin than an informal text. So, those things are things already that you can make contextual comments on. Beowulf is known as the first English text. Now, this is from around 900, so again, it's way before anything that you would look at. But if we look at that, I mean, what you will notice is that almost none of the words, would be recognisable today. It's a little bit more like German. But there's also lots of letters even that don't really exist anymore. That joined up A and E, we occasionally see it, but it's very archaic now. We get the thorn sign. We get a couple of them there, which is the old sign for TH. So we get that in there. We get that sort of odd thing that almost looks like a Z crossed with a Y. Okay, so even the letters are very different. We couldn't really look at that text and translate it into anything like modern English. It's a totally different language. That's much closer to Germanic. In 900, during the times of the Anglo-Saxons before the Norman invasion. And that's the Lord's Prayer from a similar sort of time, okay? You might recognise some words, for example, father, but again, notice the AE joined together and it's the D, not the TH in there. Heaven, heavenum. Okay, so we get that in there. Notice some prepositions that we do get. So on, to, we do get some of those sort of coming in originally. Namer, so name. Okay, so some of the words we might recognise, but largely, they are very, very different. Okay, so you might recognise father, perhaps like our heaven, heavenum. Okay, so we're seeing some words that we recognise, but by and large, the vast majority are totally different words. Notice today with the G at the end, not the Y. Fun fact, actually, if you see a sign saying ye old pub or ye old shop, the ye, it's because the Old English thorn sign either looked like that or it looked like this, okay, on what the old word for earth. And what has happened over time is that thorn sign started to be written as a Y. As that sign died out, people would write it as a Y. So now we get signs saying ye old pub. It was never ye old pub. Even back in ye old times, it was never ye. It was the. It's just that their letter for TH looked a little bit like a Y. And that's why we get that sort of carrying on now. So we get that attempt for, texts or shops or pubs to look old. But actually, that's a bit of a mistake because the letter itself has changed over time. 1066 we get the Norman invasion, and that is a big sea change in the English language. Okay, we get lots of French influences basically, and I'll show you some Middle English, and you'll see that it looks a little bit more like French. What we also get is a real class system coming into English, because by and large then those of French descent are the noblemen, and those of Anglo-Saxon descent are the peasants. And a really interesting way that we see it is in these words here. Notice the animals, cow, pig, sheep, they all come from Anglo-Saxon words. They come from Germanic. Whereas the words for our meat, beef, comes from bœuf, pork from pork, and mutton, so an adult sheep, from mouton. Okay, those words are almost, still almost the same as they still would be in French today. That's because the noblemen were the ones eating the meat, whereas those who spoke Anglo-Saxon were the ones raising the animal. So we start to get a real class system coming in English, and we still get it today. If you want to sound posh in inverted commas, you will probably use more words of French descent and Latin descent, and that comes from these times. Most of our swear words, actually, they're known as four-letter words, aren't they? Most of our swear words are one syllable long, quite short words. The vast majority come from Anglo-Saxon, and the only reason we see those words as swear words, in the past they were far more neutral. We see them as swear words now because they're Anglo-Saxon. Over time they've come to be seen as kind of low and almost cheaper and less good, whereas our scientific words, think about words like excrement, urine, come from either French or Latin. Okay, so we get that still going on to the present day. Okay, if a topical issue question touches on language change, that's a great example to talk about why our swear words actually are seen as swear words simply because they come from Germanic. So we get Chaucer in the 1300s, who writes in Middle English. Before that, most works are in Latin because of the impact of the Roman Empire. Chaucer writes in something that's closer to what we would say is modern English. It still doesn't look a fat lot like modern English, okay? But notice we can recognise more words than we could in Beowulf, okay? So, and of his craft was he a carpenter. That doesn't sound that different to what we say today. He was a carpenter, that was his craft, okay? So we're starting to get these words that are coming in there, okay? They was dwelling in Oxford, or Oxenford, yeah. So we're getting and could he certain of conclusions, yeah. So most of the words we recognise, but notice the words coming in from French, conclusion, okay, the S-I-O-N, sion. Yeah, it comes from French. So we're getting that French influence coming in there. Certain hours, again, the French influence, the soft C, okay, the C that sounds like an S, E-Y-N, hours, O-U-R. If you see multiple vowels together, often that will come from French. The word beautiful, B-E-A-U, is a French construction. So we're seeing the impact of French in this language, okay? It's actually easier for us to read now because more of those French words have kind of stuck around than the Anglo-Saxon words. So what do we start to get at this time? Okay, and like I say, you're not going to get a text this early, but it's useful to know. We start to get the H disappearing from these texts, okay? So in Old English, ring and chneka, we lose the H, okay? So it just becomes ring and neck. What we get here, which is quite interesting, is in received pronunciation. In other words, in the kind of the upper class British accent, H dropping is seen as a bit common, and notice that they'll say their H's much more often, but they won't in words like honour, because honour comes from French, and the French drop their H's. They say herbs, not herbs. They say honour, not honour. Notice that because those words come from French, even in RP, we don't drop the H. So we've still got that class impact coming in on English. So that H starts to become a class marker. So even before 1600, we're seeing language as a way of people showing what class they are. We're also getting a very interesting development here, where because the people writing in England after 1066 primarily were French speakers, even when they were writing in Middle English, they'd still use French spelling conventions. A great example of that is our word queen comes from the Old English word quen, but notice how it's been changed. Queen. That's a French construction. Okay, the Q at the start, the multiple vowels. Notice the Old English version, the Anglo-Saxon version, quen, Cwen. Okay, spelled very phonetically, much shorter vowel sounds. So even on our Old English words, they're actually adapting it and making them seem a little bit more French. And we also get this thorn sign, which was the old th, becomes a y, because that was the easiest way of typing it out, or scribing it, I should say. Obviously, no computers in the 1300s. But that letter is preserved. So the Y in Middle English would still be a TH sound. It was just their way of scribing the thorn sign. That's why now we see ye old shop. It was always the old shop. It was just the TH sign was written as a Y. So we still get this idea of French sophistication. You Google France, you'll see those sorts of things. We still are governed by this idea that French is good, and indeed Anglo-Saxon. Think about the Baldric character in Blackadder. He's seen as a bit stupid and a little bit lower. Okay, the word villain's a really good example. In Latin and in Italian, a villain, it comes from the word villa. A villain was someone who worked on a villa. Okay, but because they were often poorer people, over time, villa, or villain, started to mean low-born, poorer. Then it started to mean a bit sort of dodgy, somebody you don't want to hang around with. Then it started to mean what it means today, that they're not somebody we like very much. You see the same thing in modern times with words like chav. It's the same sort of process going on. But I think, even before 1600, you're getting this real class system in English. The way that you write and the way that you speak is a marker of how high up in society you are. Then what we get is the Renaissance, okay, and early modern English, which just is a bit of a precursor to what happens in 1600. Okay, so the Renaissance really stretches from about 13 to 1700. So even texts in the 1600s are sort of late Renaissance. But basically, it's this growing interest in science, medicine, arts. You get people like Da Vinci, who's an artist and a scientist and an inventor, all kind of wrapped as one. It's a time of great learning. And so there were massive advances, primarily in Europe, but they then influenced what was going on in English. So we see England taking on more and more loan words for scientific developments, okay? More jargon coming in. And they're still there now. Many of our scientific terms have come actually in from the Renaissance. It's inventions and it's changes and it's artistic styles that have sort of developed in the English language. I mean, the word Renaissance itself comes from French. So it shows that idea that even from this early point, England is having to loan the words in because these developments are happening elsewhere. Big event we get in 1476 is Caxton's printing press, the first way in which text could be kind of, in a sense, mass produced, not in the way that they would be today, but they can be produced much more quickly. Before that, they'd have to be hand scribed. So there'd be massive variations. If you were in Manchester or you were in London, you would spell completely differently, because there wouldn't be very much travel between the two. The spelling hadn't been standardised, and you'll see in earlier texts, spellings might be 5 different ways in the same text. William Shakespeare spelt his name multiple different ways throughout his life. So Caxton is the first time we start to see it becoming standardised. So from the late 1400s, we see these changes happening, but it takes a very, very long time. So even text from 1700s, you might see variations. It's because it hasn't been fully standardised yet, okay? The dialect he chose was a London Midland dialect. The dialect was spoken in London, in Oxford, because that's where the universities and the trade were. And again, that's where we start to get this idea that there's a correct form of English. And we still get it now. There was a school in the Black Country, in the Midlands, that banned the Black Country dialect because they thought, oh no, that's not proper. Well, what we see as proper is pretty random, just because Caxton chose one dialect to be the proper one. And that was where we get this public view that there's a correct and a wrong form of English. But it didn't fully standardise the English language, because it takes a very, very long time, even then, for these changes to be sort of standardised across the board. If you live in York, it's going to take a very long time. It doesn't matter that Caxton's picked that language for his printing press, because if most people in York can't actually read and don't write, well, that's not really going to impact the way that they use the language day to day. So we get this big breakdown that Anglo-Saxon is for the peasants and low and very simple and phonetically spelt, fewer clauses, whereas Latin is seen as educated and refined, and it's longer and it's polysyllabic. And the subject versus object matters in Latin. We get these daft rules from Latin, not daft in Latin, but it's daft that we take them into English. Who and whom, that matters in Latin because the subject and the object are different words. We try and still take those rules on, but it doesn't quite work. And often there's prefixes and suffixes on Latin words, and often they're used as euphemism. Okay, in that example, feces versus shit, they were neutral words in the past. It's just that shit comes from Anglo-Saxon, so it's seen as the swear word. Feces comes from Latin, and therefore is seen as the proper word. Okay, so we get the Germanic and Latin words there. This idea that Latin English is trying to conform to Latin rules, and this sense that the Latin rules of speech and language are influenced in English, even though sometimes they don't actually fit.